Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Hope everyone is excited for the weekend. But before the weekend comes, Building Better Open Source is here. And we're going to take a look, hopefully, at least one open source project and see how we can either make it better or maybe make it if it doesn't already exist. I think we have a couple of things in the pipeline. We'll see which one we get to first. Before we begin the session, I have a question from an anonymous attendee on expectation date about Loom and Zio. So Zio already has preliminary support for Loom that was shipped a few months ago. And the only thing that has to be done is to unify that with the work that Adam Fraser has done with streams and to cut that out as Zio 2.1. And then there's some additional tasks, I think, that can help improve support under Loom, but the support is already there, for example, for deploying fibers onto Loom's virtual threads. So that's in reasonably good shape. Please give that a try. It will only work on a JDK that actually supports Loom. And I know that some users have had success using that in production. So it's baked. It's just not all the way wrapped up into Zio 2.1 with Adam Fraser's streaming improvements. And then there's a few additional things which we will probably wait till after 2.1 in order to ship, namely around how you handle blocking executions or blocking effects on a virtual fiber. Under Loom, you actually don't need to shift to a separate thread pool. And right now we're shifting always. If you tell us to shift when we're on a blocking region, then we go ahead and shift that thread from the async thread pool to the blocking thread pool. And that's good practice pre-Loom. But post-Loom, you no longer need to do that. And shifting to another thread, it can actually slow you down. So that's the one bit of sort of cleanup work that we'll have to do, but we'll probably wait till after 2.1 to ship that. All right. And then another question, which Scott asked, which is, will recordings of this be posted to the Zyverge YouTube channel? That's absolutely true. So we're a little bit behind on that, but the recording of the first session has been done, edited, and it's in the process of being pushed to the YouTube channel and then promoted through all the usual channels. All right, so do we have a brave volunteer for this week's session? Any hands going up? So we have one from Nabil. Anyone else? Because we did some work together last week. So if there's anyone else who brought something, I might give them a chance, especially if we can finish it relatively quickly. Otherwise, we will dive into Zio HTTP again. All right, it looks like you are the only hand going up. So congratulations, Nabil. You have been promoted to panelist. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Welcome back. So what are we working on this week?
Yeah, so I would just continue with the thing from last time.
Yes.
And yeah.
Sounds good.
Let me just
share your screen and we're going to take a look. And then
yeah.
Baldwin has promised us he has some ideas for a new open source project. Maybe, Baldwin, you can bring one of those ideas into our next session, because I think it'll be really useful for people to see how you create a new open source project. How do you have to think about it? How do you have to market it? How do you have to convince yourself this is something worth investing time and effort? So Baldwin, don't be discouraged. I think jumping into a new open source project could be a lot of fun. All right, Nabil, so where did we leave this?
Yes. So we left with the idea to have like a map last time, if you remember.
Yes.
But then I realized that we actually don't need that. Because we actually already have a map in the HTTP content codec that is already like a list map from media type to binary codec.
Fantastic.
So for that, I added a new constructor that takes in like a schema and then var args of
so one
of
second,
tuples.
just to refresh people's memory and catch people up to date on the goal we're trying to accomplish with these changes is we want to say that if a user utilizes this very high level endpoint-based API, which allows you to declaratively write out your endpoints and then implement
Yes.
handlers for them, and then generate open API docs and all that fun stuff. We want to allow that user to specify exactly what responses should be produced in the event of some sort of codec error. So a codec error is not an ordinary like business error. This is not an error we expect an API to produce. If you're using it correctly, you're not going to get a codec error. But that said, if you do use it incorrectly, you certainly want to get back a message you understand and can work with using the same tools you use to work with your business errors. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here, is making sure that a user can take these very unlikely and sort of, almost like fatal errors in usage of the API and turn them into any response they want, whether that's JSON, HTML, or whatever. And so
I would
go
I
ahead.
would say it's right that they are usually fatal, right? So if these things are happening, you cannot process. I don't know about the rare part. I mean, if you are implementing like a new client for this API, right? And I don't know,
Yes.
you're just missing a header or something like this, which I guess is normal. I implemented a
Yes.
lot
Oh
of
yeah. Sure.
API calls, and I was
Right.
always missing
They
a
are
header
they're
or a query
normal. They're not in
parameter.
the happy path.
Yes,
Once your
yes,
APIs are
yes,
up and running, hopefully they're no longer encoding data in a bad way, but they
exactly.
are a normal part of the development process, and we want to make sure
Yes,
developers have great errors.
yes.
All right. So
And
you found HTTP content codec already has this mapping from media type.
exactly, and I added just like a constructor that helps me a bit, where I hand over like a schema and then a few uh, combinations of media type and a binary codec. So a binary codec is like what the schema offers us to uh, encode and decode data.
Okay.
And
So
there,
this method is saying, here's the schema, and here's one or more
yes,
codecs I want you to use together with this schema.
exactly. And yeah, I have some implementation here, right? That
Mm-hmm.
is like a default thing. So what's now interesting is the thing that I require. Maybe let me switch to the endpoint. The thing that I require now in the endpoint, right, is a HTTP codec of response type and HTTP codec error.
We talked
So
about this option the last time, right?
exactly. And the interesting thing here is now that I basically say, you need to provide me something that can transform an HTTP codec error into a response.
Yes.
And
And also vice versa,
yes, yes, but I don't know about the
potentially.
vice versa, right? Let's talk about this maybe afterwards. But
Because it's not necessary, is it?
yeah,
Right? Because
it's not necessary, and I thought about like how can we manage this, but I work first with what is there, right? Make it work, and then we can think about like how do we need a different data structure? Do we need maybe just uh, some
all right, let's
subtype or
see where
something like
this
this?
goes. So
But
the
yeah,
problem, just for everyone's benefit, that we're running into is that we've chosen one of these HTTP codecs, which is very powerful. It's actually an invertible parser. HTTP codec can go from a request or response to a specified type and then back again. And that's the interesting thing, and back again. That allows us to get free clients out of ZO HTTP. So once you define your endpoints, you can actually call them from like a different process in a microservice architecture in a type safe way. And that all works out great. And also we can use this for open API and other purposes. However, in this specific case, it seems to us what we're talking about is it seems to us like we're ever only going to need to convert from a HTTP codec error into a response. Why?
that's
Because here's your handlers, right, for your app. And then you get some input and the input's bad, and that generates an HTTP codec error, and then you have to turn that into a response. So all you need to do fundamentally is take that HTTP codec error and turn it into a response. And then on the other side of that, does a client need to be able to take an HTTP, or sorry, a response and turn it back into an HTTP codec error? Well, you can imagine using that, because then your automatic client can, if it gets one of those responses, it can maybe turn that back into an HTTP codec error, which then sort of is used to do a panic, ZO die, basically. So panic, hey, we've got a codec error. But also it might not be necessary to do that, because the client
Yeah,
already has to handle any type of response.
I think that's correct. It's probably not necessary, right?
Yeah,
But
but let's see it, right? Let's see
there
what it
are
looks like.
capabilities of the codec that are like useful for the problem we want to
Yes,
solve. And I
yes,
think it's always also good to take like gradual steps, right? Work with what you
yes,
have. And then if you
yeah,
see it doesn't fit, then you can either adjust what you have or build something new.
yes. All right, so here you've managed to take, you started with a schema for DOM,
Exactly.
and then you called transform or fail on that to get back a schema for an HTTP codec error.
So what I'm basically doing is, right, I say, I know how a DOM looks like, and I know how I can generate um, a response from a DOM object, right? Because a DOM is just like representing HTML, and of course, it's not hard to have a data structure that represents HTML and generate an HTML response out of it. That's not very complicated.
I think line 19 is a bit of a design smell, right? It's a sign that maybe
Exactly.
we don't need the invertibility. Although you could invert this because you're generating HTML with a certain structure. So if you detected that
Yes,
structure, you could go back. So it is in fact invertible. So let's just bear that in mind. So we have DOM-based schema, and then you utilize that to make a codec somewhere, right?
yes. I use that down here, right?
Yeah.
To like build a codec. Um, so one thing that is also still smelly is, so I have here this DOM-based schema, right, and build like my HTTP content codec out of it, but I actually use a different schema for the JSON response, because that's not the same. For the JSON response,
Yeah.
I take first like a case class that I could produce a JSON object
This is
from.
another design smell.
Yes,
Can,
yes. And
can you show me?
I don't say like I'm at the final stage, right? I just
Yeah.
say um I
It's almost like DOM-based schema is not relevant for this use case. Go back to HTTP codec for a sec.
HTTP
Just, yeah, zoom into HTTP codec.
HTTP codec, yes. Not the HTTP content
Oh,
codec.
error codec, right? Sorry, no, HTTP content codec.
Content codec. Yes.
All right, so here, what we may be discovering, what this design smell might be telling us, is that for the use case of codec errors, we don't need a schema. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I thought about this, right? So there is pros and cons to having some kind of schema. If I have a schema, however it might look like, wherever it might come from, that
Yeah.
would enable me to use this to, for example, say, hey, this API can return content errors that might be HTML or JSON in the Open API
Yes.
spec.
Is this schema only utilized for purposes of open API documentation generation?
I think so far, yes. So if I take a look where the schema is used, you see there's like a lot of Open API and CLI endpoint, but I think that's kind of goes in the same direction. I don't think it's used there for the so it's only used for documentation purposes, let's say.
Yeah, right. Interesting. And so we've almost got an inconsistency in this data type a little bit. Back up a second, take a look at it. Because what we're saying here with HTTP codec is that this media type has this codec. But also we're saying when you're generating open API docs, always use this schema. But that's inconsistent, right? Because With one
Yes, you
media
could.
type, we could have one schema, and with another media type, we could have another schema.
Yes.
Does binary codec, I'm just curious, does the binary codec embed a schema?
No. So a binary codec is an interface, right? It only says like it's a codec that operates on a chunk of bytes and bytes. And the codec has like only via the encoder and decoder methods for encoding and decoding and no further information. So it has only
Yes.
capabilities, it has no data.
All right. So back up a level. I understand that. So maybe the structure that we really want here is a list map from media type to a tuple. And that tuple contains two things, a schema of A and a binary codec of A. Then it eliminates this dummy schema. And also it deals with the problem of, well, if you have different media types, you might actually have different schemas with different structures that can end up producing you a value of type A.
Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. I guess the fact that it is like it is right now is um, that we didn't actually encounter such a case where the different codecs had different schemas. And now this use case of the error codec might be the first use case for that.
Right.
So it's a
All right.
discovery process.
So I think we've done some good work here. Let's go back and take a look at what you did.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically right now we're ignoring DOM-based schema here in the from. Basically, it's not really relevant. And then later on, we do JSON codec, schema-based binary codec. We end up producing a codec from a
Yes.
different schema, the default codec error schema, right? So let's
So
imagine,
so basically what this says is, right? It says I give you a schema for HTTP codec error, but it's under the underlying schema is actually either a DOM or an or this default
yeah,
codec error.
yeah,
And uh, I know based on the schema how to create an HTTP default codec error or a DOM,
hmm,
which I then know how to create a response out of it.
yeah,
Um, but I think the nice thing here that I went through this implementation is that you can basically use any type that you want to create a response. You only need to tell me how to bring an HTTP codec error into the form that you need, right? And
yes,
I think that makes sense. That's kind of what you want, right? So this is the way how to create custom errors.
yeah, right. So here's how I would, in an ideal world, prefer line 37 to look like.
Yes,
Delete everything from the first parentheses to its closing pair. Just delete that. Right? That's
this one.
imagine it working like this.
Yeah.
So here, as a user of this API, I'm looking at this and I see I'm making a codec, and my codec says for HTML content, use this text codec. For
Yes.
JSON codec or for JSON media type, use this JSON codec, and that makes sense. I'm not wondering what that
Yeah.
DOM-based schema is that I previously had to supply as its first argument. This just seems simple and logical, and more or less what you would expect. I guess one potential complication is if we really do modify HTTP codec content codec, then we're going to have to capture that schema information somewhere. So where we'll capture that is as a tuple. So the right-hand side of those arrows will look a little more complicated. It's going to be like maybe we would have a case class codec with schema, and you
Yeah.
would specify the codec and the schema together. It's basically a tuple two, but it's a better name for a tuple two. Yeah, codec with schema. Good job, Copilot.
I think
And
it was a mix of Copilot and IntelliJ, but yeah.
all right,
Yeah. And
and then we
to
would
do the
have,
same.
yep, the corresponding analog there. And we might even have helpers on such a thing because we're using the scheme. In this particular case, this isn't necessary, but in this particular case and in a common case, we're using the schema to derive the codec automatically, right? So you can
Exactly.
imagine a helper constructor in codec with schema that says, here's your schema, give me both a JSON codec and the schema. Give me both, a text codec and a schema, and so forth.
Yeah. Also, currently, this text codec is like only internal, but I think we need to at least make it somehow accessible for people to use.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, makes sense. Oh, okay, so let's undo these changes so your code still compiles, or maybe like comment them out or something so we hold on to them,
Yeah, we can do something
stash them or
like,
whatever.
yeah, I can do this, and then that should work.
Yeah, looks good. And then let's take a look at where you use this. Basically, no, really, what does it look like as an end user of endpoint to
Yeah.
specify how to turn one of these codec errors into a response? What does that look like now? Or
So,
rather, yeah, with your changes here, what does that look like?
so for now, right, this thing that I just created there is like the default one for the
Hmm.
endpoint, because I say like, you know what, this is our homemade capability, right? You
Yes,
can automatically get back a default JSON or HTML error.
yes. Ooh,
Um,
that raises a good question, though.
yes,
It's great to have these defaults, but a user will want to overwrite them.
exactly. And
And
of
how
course
does composition look like for HTTP codec error codec?
yeah,
What does the
so
plus plus operator do that combines two of these into one?
actually, so since this is an endpoint, right? There is no plus plus for this.
No, I
So
mean for the codec error.
for this one, you mean?
Okay. So how
But
would you override? Just thinking, how
yes,
would you specify
so
your?
what I do here is just like I
So
say
that's
codec error
clobber
s,
semantics. Yeah. Okay.
and
So
I just override, right? So you cannot add something, you can just say take something else.
so that solves the problem that I was about to talk about. But
Yeah,
also, you can imagine the user actually wanting a default way to turn HTTP codec error into HTML that they never want to mess with. Why? Because you would never use that in programming. That's just to open your web browser and see what's going on. So that it could be interesting if in discussing how these pieces should fit together, we enable a design where out of the box you have JSON and you have HTML. But in practice, you're going to want to customize how we turn these codec errors into JSON. So you override that part of it without necessarily changing
yeah.
our built-in ability to turn the error into an HTML error.
I think it would just be this.
Okay, or uses fallback semantics.
Yes, so but that would be right. So I mean, then it would mean if you provide something else that is the, oh no, actually I think it's also it goes into the, oops, hope you can still see my screen. I think that would might be sufficient, right? So I say
I'm not sure
I take the codec that you
because
supplied
each
to
of these
me.
codecs can handle all their inputs.
Yes, but if I do it like this, right? Like when we decode, I'm pretty
Uh-huh.
sure we start on the left and go to the right.
Probably
So
so.
if this one already handles the accept header that is provided, right? So if I say I accept JSON as something that I can read, and this one accepts JSON, it doesn't matter that this also accepts JSON, it will just not be used.
Yeah, right. So this would allow you to and
To
these
add and
are
override the things that
branching
are already
based
there.
on the header, right? The accept
Yes,
header.
yes.
Okay. So if the accept header is not, oh, what do we do if the accept header is not there? Do we
I
have a way?
think I think if the accept header is not there, right? Um, that would probably be the same as if you would have a star slash star, and then it should be the leftmost codec, the first in the list map, the first pair in the list maps that would be used.
Do you have a test for that behavior? I think that's a very useful property to have. Just if you forget to add an accept header,
Yeah,
you get back something.
yeah. I guess we can do a test for that. That's a good idea. I tested like the default one, right? I wrote test for that, and that works as expected, so that you when you hand over JSON or HTML as an accept header, then you get back the HTML or JSON
Yeah.
response.
Okay. All right. So what do we not like about this API, if anything?
So it's definitely like if you imagine you would create stuff here, right? Because even if you say I built the stuff here with my schema and I have the schema here, I still have to do something like, hey, you cannot go back, in the schema, and that would also be happening in the codec if there's any attempt to do something like that. Um, I don't know actually how the client would react to that. My focus, that what I had in mind was more for the server, because that's also like the requirements that we mainly got from developers, right? They say like the error is hidden, I cannot expose it. I have problems with
Yeah.
fixing calls.
Yeah. So a good question that we need to resolve when we're evaluating this potential architecture here is what does happen with the client and what should happen with the
Yes.
client. So let's take a look at that. The endpoint, I don't really know the name of a file, but if you open up the endpoint package, there's something in there like a client. What is it called? Endpoint executor.
This one, yes, that's the one that does the client stuff. Yeah.
Okay. And let's ignore the implementation. There's a get client method that returns an endpoint client. I think the endpoint client is the thing that we need. So maybe
And
dive into endpoint client.
no, here.
57, yeah. Mhm. Okay, so an endpoint client, it has an endpoint URL, and then it has the endpoint itself, and then it's called execute to execute some invocation on that with the specified middleware input. Okay. And then it encodes the request. And then let's see what it does with the response. Go down, client request.
Here's the response, and
So
it
it's
does here
making the
decode.
request with the default accept header, and then decode response. Ooh, look, in line 48, decode response or die,
Yes.
right?
Also, I
Oh,
think
of course, that's
here
success.
I stumbled already on that one actually, and I think this is also not quite
It's not
right.
correct.
Yes, because you should not expect that
Yeah,
the status code is a success. So only
that's right.
200 and 300s can
Yeah,
you should be able to also deserialize a 400 or
yes,
500 in
that's
whatever way
right.
you like.
That's right. And you can see if it's not a success, then it goes into the endpoint.error right there in line
Yeah.
53 and tries to use that to decode the response. And then it does a whole bunch of map errors. And then also separately, it does the middleware error thing. So really, it's trying to decode it as a successful response. But if the status code is not successful, then it uses the endpoint error to determine what to return. And I think this logic, like you say, needs updating
Yes, we
because in this day and age, you can now have any status code with any sort of codec. So that's an
exactly.
improvement that didn't maybe percolate all the way through this code here.
Yes, what we
And
need to do is actually to check, uh, like find the codec that is responsible for the status code.
yes, yeah, that's right. We need a search process. We have a lookup process
Yes.
here, and we can do that as a pre-computed map. So go up to the top here. There's some other pre-computed stuff,
Yeah, that's probably it's the
even higher,
right
I
way.
think. Well,
That's
maybe not, but
size.
we could just, add a map somewhere in here, right?
Yeah,
And
but
pre-compute a
also
bunch of stuff.
Also, maybe it needs to be even pre-computed outside of this one because
It
this would
does.
also be
Yes.
called
It needs to
every
be
time with a
in the
response, right?
constructor, so to speak. We
Yes.
can do analysis of the endpoint and create a map from status code to HTTP content codec. So we know how to
Yeah.
deserialize this particular status code. And there might be
We
multiple of those
we we
codecs.
we we have actually some pre-computed codec stuff. I think already in the endpoint. Maybe we can already
Yes.
use this and don't
Yeah.
need even
We
something
we
new.
could, yeah. And we could stick even more stuff there, more pre-computed stuff.
Yes.
All right. So we know we need to make that improvement to fix this. And when we make that, we can still see here there's going to be a process of, like, ultimately, let's imagine the client is calling the server. The
Yeah.
server takes and recognizes that the client had an error. They're missing a header or something.
Yes.
So that gets turned into a HTTP codec error. And then the user's custom logic, which you've been working on adding, so custom logic allows them to turn that into a response. Okay, so now on the client side, they get back some response. And this response is not the encoding of the success, and it's not the encoding of the typed error. So that means line 48 will fail with or die. And also handler error will fail. You can see here what's happening is dot decode response, right? It's
Yes.
going to try to, and it's going to map that error into alt left. So it's trying to unify the errors that it gets back. So it's trying to say, oh, if it's this type of error or that type of error, we need to be able to bring that to a common type using the alternator. And then it does a map error in line 56. Why does it do a, oh, it does a map because that is an error in the success. And it does a map error. Is that T a decode error? Can you see there?
So it's throwable, but
The throwable from decode
it's
response,
coming from the code response. That might
the
be
binary codec, right? Because that can
uh,
fail with any throwable.
yeah, and I think we also internally have some illegal state exceptions or something like this
Yeah.
for some edge cases. But yeah, but it can also be an HTTP error, codec error, or what it's called, like the thing that we were working with, right? Like
Yes. So that's going to end up as an illegal state exception, I think, and get basically thrown. And the underlying throwable will be captured as a cause. You can see that at the end of line 56. So the information on the codec error is maybe, well, actually, it is being thrown away, right? Because the codec error is really the response body, right? The whole response body contains
yes.
the user's custom codec error. So I think what this is telling us is that the client, in order to ensure a good developer experience, the client needs to be able to take these responses and turn them back into codec HTTP codec errors. I think that that's what it's telling us, because then
We
when we
could.
fail, it's going to be with a codec error that the user can look at and understand exactly what went wrong.
So what we could do, at least like for the default ones, right? So for example, in the JSON one,
Yeah.
I encode the name of the error and encode the message. We could just have like uh, a generic HTTP codec error that captures just the structure, right? It has like a name and an error message, and that's it. We don't need to convert it back to the exact same type that it was on the server.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we could achieve the guarantee that the HTTP codec that originated on the server actually makes it its way unmodified to the client. Can you show me the constructors of HTTP codec error just to see how
I think that's
terrible
I,
that would be? It
I
might be
wouldn't say
awful.
terrible, but
It might be
challenging.
awful.
Uh, HTTP, oops, HTTP error, codec error. I think it's this one here.
Okay, so it's a sealed trait. So this is an enum, a sum type, and it says that every
It's
HTTP codec error can be one of the following: missing header, malform method, path too short, malform path, malform status, etc. Okay, so
What I find interesting are these ones, right? Like the text codec and the path
yes,
codec. That seems
yes.
to be tricky. And also here's an option throwable. How would you serialize that?
Yeah, so there's some things that we would have to change.
Yeah.
Yeah, we would have to change some of this stuff. Right now, this cannot be serialized, and that's because codecs contain functions which can't be serialized, and then throwables cannot be serialized to and from JSON reliably. So
I'm also
we would
not
have to
sure
modify.
about validation error, how broad this is. Seems
You
also
take a peek at
like,
that. Is that in ZOHTTP?
no, I think it's schema. Yeah, schema.
Oh, well, this is very constrained, I think. Maybe not, because
Yeah,
there's
it
those
has a
A's.
generic value. Yeah, so
Great. Well, yeah, this is looking to be a bit monstrous. So this would
and
mean,
and also like when I think about it, right? So let's say we would create back the HTTP codec error.
yeah,
uh, can you do anything really useful with that? I mean, would you as a developer do anything else than
no,
take a look at the message and say like, okay, this is broken. I forgot to provide whatever, some header,
yeah,
and then you fix it manually. I mean,
yeah,
does it have a benefit that we have code that we can walk
right.
through?
I think what matters for this use case is that all of this information needs to be able to be turned into a string
Yes,
that is descriptive enough that a developer can actually fix this problem.
yes, and that's what I say, right? What I do right now is I hand over the name and I hand over here this message. And I think that should be from the general structure here, enough, right? That should be sufficient to fulfill this goal. That does not mean that all the errors here are generating messages that are meaningful
Yeah,
enough right now, but I don't think that needs to be part of this
right. I
ticket.
agree. Yeah, that
This
could
is
that could be
probably
separate.
something, yeah, and this is something,
The mechanism exists here. Message is clearly intended to
exactly.
be a string that captures the information content of the error in a way that a user or developer can actually fix it.
Yes, and I would say I would, use this, right? I would also just probably release it in some RC and let people use it, and
Yes,
then they say
yes,
this message is useful, this one is not.
yes. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so now I think we've explored this topic as well as the code quite extensively. I think now is the question to decide what comes next. And I think based on our analysis, where we need to go back to is HTTP content codec. And we need to fix a problem with that data type,
Yeah,
which
so
is that it's assuming every media type has a single schema, or rather, every media type
this one.
shares the same schema.
Yeah,
And we've already seen that's not the case.
yes,
So I think fundamentally we're looking at basically a single change here, which would be replacing this, maybe just copy paste this into a comment so we can take a look at it, where instead of storing the schema, the actual choices map has to map every media type to that tuple structure that we made, which was called codec with schema, a codec with schema of type A. And
yeah,
then you can delete the binary codec. Maybe this should be called binary codec with schema because it's a binary codec. And then delete line 15. So this would simplify your from constructor.
yes,
And in a good way, I think, that makes it easier for a developer
yeah,
to use correctly. It would also remove a problem that, even though we haven't seen the implications of this problem, still, as more and more code is built on these data types, eventually other code could run into the situation where it's using the top level schema, but in fact, the schema for XML is different, and you should use the schema that should be
yes,
associated with the binary codec itself. So I
yes,
think
yes,
this is a good positive change, even if we ignore the work we're trying to accomplish. I just think it's
yeah,
probably the right thing to do. But also, what it does for us is it enables us to simplify this API. And then the other thing that we should probably take a look at is how we specify these codec errors in endpoint. You added a single method. I would like to see what that is.
The endpoint one, you mean? This one here.
Right. So this is codec error as. And how did you arrive at that naming convention? I'm just curious. Are there other ases?
No, no, I don't think so. Also, there are not other things that look similar to that, right? Because
So we need to fix this, right? We need to make it consistent with the other methods, have
yeah,
consistent naming conventions and so forth. And also, what would you say? What would you say? Is it common for these methods of endpoint to be additive or to have clobber semantics? Let's maybe search for copy and let's see all the times copy is used here. Self.copy. Every time there's a self.copy, we're copying around this record and we're clobbering one or more field. Maybe we can see that. So for examples, right? Examples in and examples out.
yes,
It looks like we're not clobbering, right? We're doing whatever examples on output does. Can you just zoom into that? Yeah, just zoom into examples. That's additive, right?
yes, yes.
So examples is saying you already have your codec. Let's add some more examples to whatever examples have already been
I,
provided. So that's additive.
I think actually it's probably for everything that it's additive.
Okay.
I mean, I have been in this code.
Because a user can always call .copy themselves. So that makes sense. You can always copy the case class and clobber
Yes,
one or more fields without very difficult syntax. It's very easy to do that. So that implies to me what we should be aiming to do in our method here is maybe use this or operator, right? First off, maybe it should be changed from, you can see that the additive methods, they have a similar name to the thing that they're changing. So I think codec error works. Maybe just, we can't call it codec error because there is a codec error, right?
I mean, we could rename the field. Nobody would stop us from that.
Right. So the other place that has a similar example is, oh, what is the method to change the error? Because they have that problem there.
No, I think actually it's also just
It couldn't be called error. Look for
no, no,
def
no.
error.
Uh,
Maybe it's called ERR. There's no def error. How do
um,
you change the error?
we definitely do somewhere. Ah, yeah, out error. That's the one.
Okay, because it's the output error. So
Yes,
maybe we would call this out codec error. Does that make sense?
that seems consistent. So this would be
Or would this be, would you view this, the distinction between in and out is the endpoint has its input type and then it has the output type. And the output type
yes,
is the thing you get out of it when you're calling the endpoint. So hence out error, because you might get that out when you call the endpoint. So I guess it is kind of an output codec error. It's the error you get from calling the endpoint in the event there's an HTTP codec error, right?
yeah.
Oh, okay. So let's take a look at out error and see how it compares with this one here. Maybe move it down just so it's alphabetically next to the other ones. Well, that's quite interesting. So look at the order of alternation there. So
It's the other way around.
it's the other way around. Line 518 says, first, we're going to use this existing error codec. And then if that doesn't work out, we're going to switch over and use the new specified content codec. And what we're saying here is we want to invert that. We want to prefer the user specified codec before we fall back, or rather the new specified codec before we fall back to the old one. So I'm just trying to think about this. I don't like inconsistencies like this. I'm trying to think if there's a way to justify this inconsistency. Usually inconsistencies like this, they tell you about something wrong in the design. So I'm trying to think here, is there a way to justify this inconsistency, or is this telling us that there's something wrong here? And maybe it's not wrong with this one, by the way. Maybe it's wrong with
It's the old
out
one.
error.
Yeah, I just thought about the same. So
I think you can argue that it is wrong without error, right? Because let's say you have this endpoint which says 400 is going to map to this response, and then you as a developer decide to reuse that endpoint, and you're like, no, in this code, 400 should map to something else. If you
Yeah.
don't have the ability to override the 400, then you can't even reuse that endpoint. You have to start again and build the same thing again. So I think overriding
And
is critical here, the ability to override. And this is very specific to errors because you can have multiple errors and different errors associated with different responses. So it makes
I
sense to me.
see, but I see there. Uh, so another, there's some thoughts that came to my mind immediately, right? So the first thing
Yeah.
is, in this case, we do assume that the left codec is preferred over the right one, right?
Yes.
As you said already before, we should have a test for that, but I
Yes.
think it's safe to assume that we probably did that because that's like the normal thing, the normal behavior.
Yes.
I think there are other data structures in the zero world that behave the same. So
Yes.
it would be odd if it wouldn't be like that. The other thing is, um, take your example. You have like this error type, right? And you say for this one I produce a 400, and now I want to have like a modified version of the endpoint, and I say I want to return now a 200 for that one or something like that.
Yes.
Um, then that this exists, that this behavior is like this, and that the thing is not reachable would then also be needed to take into consideration with the documentation tools, right? Because then if I generate open API from that, I don't want to generate a 200 and a 400,
Yeah.
but only a 200 response.
Yeah. That's right. You wouldn't want to generate two 200 responses. Yeah. You would just want to generate one because, right? Does the open API even allow you to say this
No, no, you
200
you can
response?
you cannot have two 200s, right? But I can have a
Okay.
200 and a 400, but they would result from the same source data structure. But in zero HTTP, that's not possible, right?
Right.
So then it would mean in this case, I would generate an open API documentation that is simply wrong because it can
Yes.
never be 400.
Yeah. Right. But we already have this problem to some degree. And that's
Probably.
because you can already form, right? All you have to do is you could call copy yourself, or it's not even necessary to call copy. You can just keep on specifying 200 maps to this, 200 maps to this response, 200 maps to this. You could do that 100 times. And then in the open API documentation generator, you have to
Yeah.
look in and you're like looking for 200 and you don't find a single 200, you find 20 of them. And so you still have
I
to handle, you have
but
to,
I think but yeah, okay.
not only
Yeah.
do you have to handle that, but you also have to know which of those wins, right? So when you're looking at all 200, you have to know how this is implemented in ZOHTTP such that,
Uh, actually, now that I think about it, maybe we don't have this error right now because I think alternator tells us it's an either, right?
yeah,
So because of the position information from the either, we then would actually know which one it is. So you might yeah, and I don't know, probably I'm not 100% sure, even I wrote it myself. Maybe the schema for the open API also says in like it's 200 and it's A or B.
is this even compiling that or
Uh
operator?
this one here.
It compiles?
I
Because I'm just
think
wondering
not.
how
No,
that
probably
either,
not. No, the either wouldn't probably not. Or no, it doesn't matter. I guess. Or
well,
no.
this
Here
is
it's
not an
also
either,
yeah. That's not an
right?
either.
So
Yes, yes. That would probably not
yeah, so
work.
the either won't structure won't exist. We'll have to
I
pour it
mean,
away, so to speak. We'll have to merge
uh,
that, which means we'll lose information on which side it came from. But in
yes.
any case, I think what I've convinced myself from this discussion is that having the ability to override is useful. And right now, the way out air works is no overriding is possible.
Yeah.
So regardless of the complications that it entails for OpenAPI, and it does entail some complications, but some of those complications are already being ignored because of the example of having like 200 different 200 responses, right? You have to do something there.
Yeah, but when I think about it, can you combine it without ending up, so there's like this alternations or something like this that you can call on endpoint.
Yeah,
And I think that one is used to generate the open API stuff. And I think then if you have like multiple 200s, then what's ending up is like what I just said, like you have like in the open API a map for the 200
yeah.
as a key, and then a JSON schema with a lot of ORs.
So you're saying in OpenAPI, it's already flattened, so to speak,
Yes, exactly. It's
and
flattened
you
out.
document everyone individually.
Yes, and just say it could be this or that or that or whatever.
Okay. All right. So you don't actually have to deal with that problem. Any case where we're introducing an alternation. So we introduce an alternation and that's going to go away.
Yeah,
Okay, well, that solves our problem. It solves our problem in a way that generates a lot of documentation potentially. If you were to use this a lot, then you could end up with a lot of documentation. Some possibilities might not actually be there, but I think that's okay. I
but
think that's
this,
okay. It means open API documentation generation is not broken and won't be broken if we decide to invert the order of things here, right? It means
yes,
it's still going to generate docs, right? So I think where where I'm at is we flip the order of alternation in out air and out air all of its variations. There's like 3 or 4.
um, yeah, but now that I thought about again with this alternator and stuff, um, is this actually necessary? Because when we don't really use that side first, or do we? I mean, do we do that on the client side then? I don't know. Uh, but like on the server side, like when I produce the output, right? It doesn't matter because uh, if I have like an either of an either of an either of an either, I know because of the position in the either, like where is the data, which codec I have to use to decode it, to
Yeah,
encode it, sorry. But for the decoding, of course, I don't have the position information. I just get like a JSON or HTML or whatsoever, right? And I need to basically just try out. I try the first one, doesn't work, I try the second one.
he uses he uses fallback semantics
Yes.
for decoding. I'm going to try this. If that doesn't work out, I'll try this, and so forth, all the way down
So
the
so
list.
so for the client side, the order probably matters. For the server side, not.
Trying to think if that's true. Yeah, but if it matters on either side of client or server, then it has to matter fully for this
Yes,
API.
yes. But my question was like, does it matter at all? Like I'm sure how the server works now that we talk
Well,
about, and
Scala
I
has to
read,
compute
but
that type, right? Alternator is used to take two types and to fuse them into one. So Scala needs to know what type to return, so the order does matter for alternator. Now, it
okay.
won't affect it in the common case that you start with no air and then you move to an air type, because that ends up being, I think, nothing on one side and that goes away.
Yeah.
All right. So to summarize our conversation, and tell me if you agree or if I missed anything, the basic approach seems to be correct. And the simplification you made, recognizing that HTTP content codec does a lot of what we were trying to do anyway in our own data type from last session, is correct. We have identified an imprecision in that data type, and that imprecision is the fact that it stores a schema and then it stores the map
A binary
from
codec.
media type to binary codec. And that's not correct because different media types might be associated with different schemas. So change number one would be deleting the top level schema and instead pushing that into something binary codec with schema that's a tuple of those two things. And then separately, first off, changing the name of codec air as into out codec air, but also changing it to have additive semantics using our, I would say, foresight into the very common use case where a user wants to override the JSON but not touch the HTML or XML or all the other sort of default ones that we just provide for free if the user doesn't want to have to care about that, allowing them to override that. So having this method here preferentially prefer the user's specified codec, which means sort of flipping the alternation. Once we flip the alternation and once we move that method down to the other ones that are similar, we could see a discrepancy, and that discrepancy could be solved. That discrepancy, it could just be that this is a fundamental problem, or rather it's a fundamental aspect of the domain that there is going to be a discrepancy, but I don't see that. Rather, I suspect that the discrepancy is telling us that something is wrong. It's a smell telling us that something is wrong in this design. I think what the design wants to be is the way we engineered out codec error. Most likely out error does not have an engineered order of composition. Most likely, just a guess. I mean, I wrote some of that code. I should know, but I don't. It's been too long. I suspect it doesn't have an engineered order of composition, and it's probably okay to flip those because it's going to make the error handling uniform across all these different APIs, which will lead to a much better developer experience because they'll be able to predict what happens because we're always using the same rule for combining or rather for deciding which ones we prefer when you try to add more error information into your endpoint definition.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Did I miss anything?
No, I think it kind of makes sense. The question is then, what about the non-errors, right? So there's also out codec. It's the same, right? Then it should be also flipped, right? It would be the same logic
That's a
that
good point.
applies
I
here.
didn't even consider that. So out codec
Like with the
is calling.
within, it's not a problem because in is not using alternation, but so not or but and, right?
Yes. Oh,
But
well, with which one?
for the in methods.
Oh, you
Because
might be right. Yes,
for in you
yeah,
need to provide
yeah,
all information.
yeah.
It cannot
I
be
think you're
A
right
or B.
about, let's think about that just for a second. So out codec is saying the success should be this. So if it uses self output or the new codec, then it's basically saying we're always going to prefer whatever the endpoint had originally, which does seem to inhibit reuse. Because in an ideal case, you have an endpoint and you want to tweak it. You want to change something. You want to change one response. You want to do whatever. As many times APIs come in families, and they're all very similar to each other. Just want to tweak something in this one
But
case.
on this case, right? If I think about that one, and you do this for the server side because this is probably more likely where you do something like this because you have like an API that has like slight variations, right? Um, I don't think then this out error or out coding is really helpful. Why? Because if I say like I want to tweak it in a way that I produce actually this output and not that one, would I use that alternation on that point, or would I not say, okay, before I even call out codec, I take this as a value, put it somewhere, and then I call once out here and once out here with two
I
different
think you
types.
could make the argument that the user can do that, right? But if we're going to have additive methods, then those additive methods should allow overriding previous decisions. That's strictly more powerful than saying your additive methods can never override previous decisions. They can only handle cases
Yeah,
that were not decided previously. That's
I
strictly weaker than saying additive methods are always going to allow you to alter existing decisions
yes.
and should, in theory, enable more reuse.
I, I agree with what you said, right? But I think in practice, like if I really want to have like, I own all the code, which is probably likely. I don't think I
Sure.
would share like an endpoint in a library or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and I want to have like two variations with two different output things. I would
Yes.
probably have an endpoint definition where I don't define the output yet, right? And then just
Sure, but right, you would have to know that as a developer. And if you didn't know that, you would try to override something and it would fail.
yeah,
It's
but
like a
I
map.
think
When you have a map, the
I
map is
I
the paradigm here for a
I
developer.
had I don't say we should not do the change, but what I
Yeah,
say is like if I would go and teach this, for example, right?
right.
I wouldn't say do that. And also I think naturally the developer would not really like the outcome of that. Why? Because if I do this, right, then I have like the output type that I actually don't want, and then I add the one that I want to override this with,
Yes.
and then I need to provide an either the of one of these two types instead of just the type directly. And then I would say
Okay,
like,
that's a fair point, is that because composition, because adding information into the outputs of the endpoint adds these either structures to keep track of it if it's left-hand side or right-hand side, at least pre-Scala 3, maybe there's something we could do for Scala 3, because it adds that information. It does seem like you would want to not specify the output codec.
yes,
But still, I think I
yeah,
think
I
it's
agree.
safe change to make. I don't see it causing any problems. The only thing you
No,
can argue about is, will you actually use it?
I mean it is a breaking change in the meaning that if I update my zero HTTP, right, I have
Yes.
to change everywhere the types, and I have to make a left to a right and a right to a
Do
left,
you have
something like
to?
that.
You only have to if you are using error composition or output composition,
Yes, exactly. I
which is probably
only
very unlikely to be used.
I don't know about that.
Okay. Well, that's certainly worth paying
So
attention to. I do think I think
I
map semantics are better here and more expected for developers, because a map, if you add a
yes,
key that already exists, then it
you
overwrites that value in the map. And that's exactly the argument we're having is, if you add a new key to this map, should it give you back the old map if it already has that key in it? And I think the answer is
I
no.
agree.
And I think if you do that, it will confuse people.
I actually agree, and I'm kind of happy that with something that is not really related, we discovered this before we made the
Yes,
final release. Be-
exactly.
because because
Because
we
you
could
can't change this, right? Once we
no,
ship
no,
3.0, you can't change something like this.
yes,
Yeah. All right. So you have your homework, right?
yes, yes.
Okay. And if you get to this in time for next Friday, that's fantastic. If not,
I
that's
I
okay too. We have a couple volunteers. I think we have Baldwin and
yes.
Samson who have ideas about a new open source project.
If you have like 2 more minutes, I have actually one question regarding
Yeah.
this. Because we were also talking about like um so that it's not possible to expose these errors to the outside, right? To do something like
Yes.
logging. And I was thinking about um, if it's right to handle the errors inside here at all, um, or if it should maybe be the default that we always say if you have an endpoint and you return a root, you have something that has an HTTP HTTP codec error as the in the error channel, right? And we provide something that you can get rid of this like a middleware or something. No, middleware I think is not possible. But we provide something, right, that you can add to it and then it's gone, or, or that you maybe have like an alternative version of the implement method that exposes it. Because I think even though these changes seem to be good and handling a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah.
The problem of the logging, I don't see how it can fit in here. And I don't see how it can fit in if you handle it already before exposing the thing that you build to the user.
Right. Yeah. So the question is basically, even though this approach is very close to being working, and I think cleaning up some things, is this overall the right approach to this problem, given that there's other potential ways to solve it that maybe make it easier for a user to basically, install a callback that is called whenever an HTTP codec error is generated. I think that's an interesting question. Right now, we're trying to solve it by saying we're going to make this solution declarative, which means we solve it at
Yes,
the level of endpoint. And that allows us on the plus side, and this is why I think it's not a bad solution, is it allows us to generate documentation for these
exactly.
error types, which might have a different structure than other types of errors in your application. So I think that is a useful property, and we get it for free. Well, not for free. We still have to modify OpenAPI document generator, but it just sort of comes along for the ride because of this architecture that you've chosen.
Yes.
Um, the other, the thing we lose by making this declarative is that in our handler or middleware, wherever, we have no ability to like listen to the creation of these HTTP codec errors and decide to do something different, decide to do something on the side.
Yeah, exactly. The main thing I think you probably want to do are side effects, right?
Yeah,
And I actually also discovered this week uh, a similar or like a related problem where I think it's the same sort, like where we just say like, hey, you know what, we can handle this errors deep
yeah,
inside, but it has problems with not exposing the stuff to the user, and the user likes to have access to this. So we do this, for example, also in the Netty server handler, that we generate immediately a response for internal Netty errors. And then the user says, yeah, that's nice, but then I have only access to the response, and information is gone and I cannot
yeah,
access it anymore.
yeah,
And I think we really have to think about this, and if this is like a good behavior, if it's a good default behavior, if it should be opt out, if it should be, I don't know,
yeah,
always expose errors to the user so they can handle it however they want to, you know?
yeah. Okay, well, let's think about this from a different perspective, which is, let's say we ripped it out of endpoint. Now, when you implement an endpoint, you have to specify not just a way to implement it, but also a way to turn codec errors into a response. And if you don't specify that, maybe there's a default. Um, how much do we lose by not having that information be available to open API documentation generation and potentially the client, I guess? So the two main ways you can use that endpoint definition, aside from just implementing it with your
A-
server-side logic, is the client and
Actually,
open API.
I just realized we have a similar problem already that we uh, had identified before, and that we also did not solve yet.
Yeah.
So, for example, we have here like this middleware, right?
Yes.
Which is kind of the same, because we say it does something, but what it does, we actually don't know. This is deferred to later, right?
Yes.
We only have a description of it. And we still have to solve the problem for authentication and authentication schema that you
Yes.
probably need an open API like very, very badly, right? Because
Right.
that enables like you go to the open API website, your
Yes.
Swagger UI, and you can do requests. And if you don't have the
For
authentication
that one,
information, it doesn't
I'm
work.
thinking maybe what we should do is strip out this metadata descriptor from endpoint. I mean, this is a topic for a different discussion, but strip it
Uh,
out and just put
but
security
I
as an
understand.
enum.
Yes, but I just say like the the problem is kind of similar, right? You want to have you want to be able to do some descriptive things in Open API while the actual in the endpoint, while the actual implementation that might also do side effects and something like this comes
Yes.
later.
Yes. Yeah. It is very similar. The implementation has lots of details, and trying to package them all up into the endpoint definition is probably a mistake, basically.
Uh, what
All
do you
right.
mean?
Well, I just mean in the sense that like it may have been a mistake for us to try to capture the requirements of metadata in endpoint. And
Requirement.
maybe it's a mistake for us to capture the way we convert HTTP codec error to responses, or maybe the mistake is in the opposite direction. Maybe we should be capturing everything. But there's a discrepancy here
Yeah.
between what we're capturing and the implementation side, and it feels like that's wrong. Like there's either we should go one way or the other way with that. Anyway, I think those are separate topics. The question is, do we want to pursue the changes we talked about today and basically say, okay, for ZOHTTP 3.0, this is going to be the way you specify how to convert codec errors into responses, regardless of any drawbacks it might have.
I,
I do
I,
believe
I
it might
s-
have drawbacks. I don't think that they're fatal for 3.0 release.
yeah. So I think my personal gut feeling says um, I would go rather the way to put a lot of stuff in the endpoint to have their as much information as possible,
Yeah.
and then find other ways, maybe ways, I don't know, maybe ways that are a little bit hacky under the hood to do the side effect stuff,
Right.
like the logging or something like this.
Right.
And also the question is, if you have like uh
And by the way,
if
I
you,
do think we should be auto logging. We should be using
yeah,
zeolog to log errors like HTTP codec errors.
yes, and maybe that's all we need, maybe all we need is like some configuration value that says
Yeah.
turn this on or off, or maybe just the default logging configurations are enough, right? We give the
Yes.
logger a name, and then you
Yep.
can say, hey, I turn on this logger and I turn off
That's
this
right.
logger.
Yeah. I like that. All right. So we can work on that later, but basically what we're going to do is try to make this approach work and
Yeah.
then do logging at some point later, which could be done in a backward compatible way so it doesn't need to hold up the 3.0 release. This will involve some change, so it is good to get this in before we cut the final release of 3.0.
By the way, I think I will do an RC6 probably today, because I
Oh,
merged in some bug fixes for RC5 that bothered people.
okay,
And
fantastic.
so if anybody is listening, you'll
Yes,
probably be happy about the
RC6 is coming
RC6.
soon. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Nabil. Thanks everyone for showing up. Had a great time this session. I think we did
Yes,
some
thank you
good
too.
stuff and look forward to seeing everyone on next Friday.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.